President Donald Trump's policies have triggered dramatic changes in the geopolitical and international security landscape. Global norms are being shattered, and the international system is under severe stress. Governments around the world are scrambling to formulate responses to the policies out of Washington. A few countries, to varying degrees, are pushing back. In some cases, international organizations are examining their options for survival. All countries of the Americas, which include Caribbean countries, are directly or indirectly impacted. It's not exactly doomsday, but it is disconcerting. My guest, Dr. Andy Knight, is a University of Alberta Distinguished Professor and a Fellow of the Royal Society of Canada. Professor Knight is a world-renowned expert in international relations and global politics, and his contributions to scholarship, policy, and service have been prolific and wide-ranging. Born in Barbados, Professor Knight earned degrees from three Canadian universities: McMaster University, Dalhousie University, and a PhD in International Relations at York University. He is the inaugural Provost Fellow in Black Excellence and Leadership at the University of Alberta. He has co-authored, authored, or edited 16 major books, 80 chapters in edited volumes, and over 70 peer-reviewed journal articles. I am your host, Ambassador Curtis Ward. Up next on Carib Nation Television. Since President Donald Trump assumed office on January 20, 2025, there have been dramatic changes in the geopolitical and international security landscape. Governments around the world are scrambling to understand how to respond to the policies coming out of Washington. All countries, including the countries of the Americas and in the Caribbean region, are impacted in one way or the other. Some countries, to varying degrees, are pushing back. Others, without the requisite capacity to do so, are silently waiting what may befall them. Global norms are being shattered, and the international system is under stress. One of the questions facing the international community is how to respond, and they are now examining choices for survival in some cases. And it's not exactly doomsday, but it is quite disconcerting. My special guest today is Distinguished Professor Dr. Andy Knight. Welcome, Professor Knight, to Carib Nation TV.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. It's nice to be with you on this program. I'm looking forward to having this discussion. I think it's a very important discussion that you're raising. And I think it's important for us to sort of put things in a broader perspective. As we were talking just before coming on, to the program today, I was saying that there's a tendency to want to shift our attention from one point to the next, and there are multiple different lights of points that we need to sort of address. Sometimes when we do that, we get caught up in the nitty-gritty of what's happening without looking at the overall big picture. So I like to start with the big picture, which is something that you just raised, which is the possibility that we're moving towards a doomsday kind of scenario. I'd like to call it the attack on global multilateral institutions of Donald Trump is probably an indication of an attack on the pillars of world order that were created back in the 1940s by the United States and its allies, which led to the creation of the United Nations system, which led to a number of policies linked to multilateral approaches of collaboration and cooperation. Um, and I think that we're witnessing a shift now, a transitional moment, which I call the interregnum in an essay I did recently in International Journal. I call it the interregnum. This is going after the concept that was used by Antonio Gramsci when he talked about the interregnum as being that space of turbulence, uncertainty, and flux that sort of uh, characterizes a period of a movement away from one world order to the next. And I think we are witnessing, since 1989, 1990, with the end of the Cold War, a shift away from the old world order that was created in 1945 to something else that's new. And we don't know exactly what that new thing is going to look like, except to say that we are seeing now firsthand the attacks on the very pillars of world order that was created in 1945, the UN system, regionalism, the attacks on multilateral approaches, and the attacks on global collective solutions. We're witnessing this because the Americans seem to be moving back into a period of the 1930s when they were isolationists. And I think that's where we start because this gives a broader picture of what's happening before we get into the nitty gritty of what the Trump administration is announcing on a daily basis.
Absolutely. And speaking of daily basis, these announcements are coming like a tsunami
It
in
is,
rapid fire.
yeah,
And I told a colleague this morning that it's a tsunami of arrogance and imperial hubris.
yes,
And the international community, while expecting some of this based on the prior Trump administration, did not expect it to come so fast
yes,
and with such intent to destroy what I'd say international order and international norms. And so, as we look at that broader picture, give me your thoughts on the impact on the international system, primarily the United Nations and its agencies. I would welcome your thoughts on that.
yes. When you look at it, the first Trump administration, I call it Trump 1.0 because I call this one Trump 2.0 now. But when
Mhm.
you look at the first Trump administration, obviously it's marked by chaos, uncertainty, tremendous amount of mistakes that were made by the Trump administration at the time. And of course, they were right in the midst of a pandemic. And the kinds of solutions that the United States was proposing at the time to deal with the pandemic was not coordinated with the World Health Organization. As you know, they were trying to actually undermine the World Health Organization. So what we're witnessing really is a much more coordinated attempt to attack the pillars of Westphalia, to attack the pillars of multilateral cooperation, um, by using unilateralism. You can see this reflected in what are called the American First strategies that are being proposed by the Trump administration right now.
And America only.
Yeah, the American only, yes. And the thing is that they have now it's a much more coordinated way of addressing this. Before, I think in the first Trump administration, he had never really governed before, and now he knows that there are certain things you have to do in order to govern in a much more effective way.
And
In
if I
terms
may just add, at this point, it has all
Mhm.
been spelled out in the Project 2025 document.
That's exactly right. And that's what I was getting at, is that now they have a document now created by some of his former staff members in the first administration, but also others at the Heritage Foundation, for example, people who have been, associated with what is called the MAGA movement, but they don't have a sort of intellectual um, uh, foundation now for trying to implement policies in a way that they didn't have in the first Trump administration. So Trump 2.0 is much more effective in a negative sense. In other words, it's doing a lot more damage from day one to the present. And it will continue to do this because, the chaos, the uncertainty is still there. But now they have a document that they can draw on to go after the policies that they would like to implement, which would transform the United States. I mean, this emphasis on America first, the strategies that prioritizes national interests over collective global solutions, a return basically to the 1930s isolationist policies of the United States, which emphasized things like protectionism and unilateralism. This is the kind of world that they're going back to. Instead of making America great again, what they're doing is making America, you know, um, pre-hegemonic again, because this is before the United States became a hegemon. It was, as you know, it was very isolationist. It didn't
Mhm.
want to be part of any international system that would address global problems. Uh, that changed, of course, after World War II, where then the United States was encouraged then to become part of the building of a new multilateral system, namely the United Nations. And I think that's where you want to get the next part of the discussion, to look at the impact this is going to have on the United Nations system. I think
Absolutely.
it's going to weaken, without doubt, the United Nations authority to deal with public and political uh, 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 um, agendas. It would certainly weaken the UN's authority through things like criticism of international institutions, through withdrawal of funding from certain sub-agencies of the United Nations, the World Health Organization, the World Trade Organization, UNESCO, etc. And when you start to link the contributions that you make to multilateral institutions to your political domestic agenda, and you have an American first policy, what happens is that you decide that, instead of dealing with the problems of the rest of the world, we're going to deal with the problems within our borders first. And that's
Yes.
where Trump is right now, I think, in his thinking.
You mentioned some of the international agencies
Yeah,
um, that will be impacted. Withdrawal from the Paris Accord on climate change is another very important
that's right.
aspect of this administration. And
Yeah,
what is quite disconcerting is that the the actors being placed in this administration are many of them are the architects of the blueprint, Project 2025. As a matter
correct.
of fact, one of the most powerful members of the administration now wrote a very significant part of Project 2025.
Yes,
Now, you mentioned UNESCO, you mentioned the World Health Organization, and the UN itself relies heavily on US funding
Correct.
for its budget on peacekeeping and operational and so on and so forth, humanitarian assistance.
Yes.
How threatened do you think those contributions are at the moment?
Well, it's time to tell in terms of the kind of announcements that will be made about withdrawing funding from the UN system. But you know that the Heritage Foundation, which is one of the architects behind Project 2025, they've for a very, very long time have written about written articles about what will the world be like without the United Nations. In other words, um, would the world be in a better place without the United Nations? And in fact, they come to the conclusion that the world would be much better off without the United Nations. So I think this attack on the United Nations system by the Trump administration is a reflection of that long-term thinking. I remember doing my PhD, my doctoral studies at York University many years ago, and at that time I was looking seriously at the Heritage Foundation as a challenge to the United Nations system at that time. And these challenges don't really go away. Sometimes they get repressed. Sometimes they're ignored, um, or sometimes we manage to overcome them. But they come back in different forms. And in this particular case, the Heritage Foundation's thinking about the United Nations system as being an obstacle to the power of the United States has now come back again. So what I think you'll see is that there will be challenges to the funding of the United Nations system itself, not just the agencies, the World Health Organization, the World Trade
Right,
Organization, UNESCO, etc., but also to the UN system per se, the Security Council, the General Assembly. As you know, the United States gives about 30% of the overall budget of the United Nations.
right.
So it's responsible for 30% of the overall budget. 25% of the overall budget of peacekeeping, I think, comes
You
from the
see?
United States. So this is a serious challenge to how the UN system will operate. It always depended in a large part, right, on the hegemonic power. The hegemonic power, the United States was the one that was responsible for creating the United Nations in the first place. And therefore, while it collaborated with other countries, it always took a kind of a very important leadership role within the organization in terms of funding and to make sure that the what I call the material capability of the institution was intact through US funding. But we've noticed in the past, we've had UNESCO, there was withdrawal from UNESCO in the past. We've had withdrawals from different sub-agencies of the organization. And we've also had an attempt by the United States to slow down the giving of resources to the United Nations by withdrawing certain percentage of its financial support to the organization. So if that happens, that's definitely going to cause an erosion in the United Nations' ability to coordinate its responses to global challenges like climate change and to ignore global attempts to deal collectively with things like pandemics. Um, it would definitely cause problems in terms of recognizing the importance of humanitarian crises in places like the Congo, in Gaza. We know exactly where Trump now stands on Gaza. But I
But
think,
before we get to that, however,
yes,
I want us to look at the impact
hmm
on humanitarian assistance,
yes,
given that the United States contributes about 40% of global humanitarian assistance aid. Um, and based on, and lots of the aid goes to one or two agencies of the US, particularly
USAID,
USAID,
yeah,
but also through humanitarian agencies of the
yes,
UN.
hmm
And they've got funding from UNRWA,
yes,
they're pulling out of WHO, they are pulling out of UNESCO,
hmm
and so on. There
yes,
is a humanitarian budget
yeah,
within the UN system, which is hardly ever fully funded.
That's right.
And it is severely challenged as it is, with the
Hmm.
US withholding of funding.
Hmm.
How do you see this in terms of the global population that is in need of humanitarian assistance? How is that going to impact them?
Well, I was listening yesterday to a panel talking about this, um, and of course, the first thing that comes to mind, of course, is the withdrawal, the attempts to eliminate altogether USAID, which is like unheard of, a very substantive portion of U.S. largesse when it comes to humanitarian assistance came through the Congress, was approved by the Congress to create this organization, the fund of the USAID, and to think that a president will unilaterally decide that UNAID will no longer exist and that the people working in different parts of the globe doing tremendously good work in different parts of the globe would simply lose their jobs. That's now under serious concern for the U.S. Congress. And it seems as though the Congress, because it's now controlled by the Republicans, uh, they're not willing to they're not willing to go against what the president is doing in this particular area. They're completely sold on the idea of dealing with American problems first. And that means that they do not care about the rest of the world. They don't care about the suffering of people in the Congo, the suffering of people in uh, Myanmar, the suffering of individuals who are refugees from horrific situations, the hunger and the suffering of malnutrition of children, children affected by conflicts, women abused by husbands and abused in their society. All these humanitarian problems are not going to be addressed any longer without the help and the assistance of USAID. Just think about the problem in our own region of Haiti, for example. Uh, there are people in Haiti that need to have USAID's assistance because, as you said correctly, the United Nations is not able to devote as much money and humanitarian assistance as an institution. So therefore, it depends very much on organizations like USAID. In Canada, they depend on, for example, the former CEDA, this Canadian agency to fund these type of humanitarian causes, or IDRC in some cases in developing countries to fund developing causes. But the whole agenda of the sustainable development approach, the sustainable development goals that were set is now in jeopardy
Yes,
because the poverty that we're trying to eliminate, the hunger, the suffering, the humanitarian problems that we're trying to address by trying to meet those sustainable development goals, those things are now under threat again.
yes.
So I believe that you're right. I mean, I think this humanitarian crisis is one of the biggest concerns for the entire globe.
How can we ignore hunger and death and diseases?
And
Humanity
yeah,
is
it's
at
a
a
very
crossroads
humane.
now.
Yeah,
We're at a crossroads.
yeah,
And
we are.
if the US is not a player,
Right.
our game is collapsing.
Yeah,
Because while other countries, European Union, Canada, and so on,
right.
will step in and try to plug some of the holes,
Yeah,
they do not have the resources
that's
to
correct.
cover what the US now contributes.
Yeah,
Let's move on a little bit because there are so many things on the agenda, and
yeah.
I know we have limited time.
Hmm.
And I want to dig a little deeper into the impact of USAID being frozen out of development assistance and humanitarian work. out
Hmm.
of health, education, and so on. What does that mean for countries globally that now benefit from USAID programs? And there are dozens of countries, dozens of poor countries whose health and education depends on USAID projects and programs. But I also want you to zero in on the impact on the Caribbean region.
Hmm.
And so take it away.
Well, one of the serious challenges that we face in the Caribbean is that we are small states in the region. We happen to be next door to the United States. It's like I remember Lloyd Asworthy, when he was Foreign Minister of Canada, he used to talk about um, Canada being next door to the United States. It was almost like a mouse living, sleeping next door to the elephant. And when the elephant rolls over, well, you know what happens to the mouse, right?
Yes.
Um, so when the United States is going through this tremendous, I call it an internal implosion, because there's no way that the United States can actually maintain its leadership role globally, financially, and otherwise, if it starts to implement the kinds of tariffs that they're talking about against Canada and Mexico and different places. But when they go through this tremendous implosion, economically and politically, it's going to have an effect on small Caribbean states. It's going to have an effect on the relationships that the Caribbean countries have had for some time with the US being the hegemonic power in the region. Now, I think there are a couple of things that I think will happen. One is we have to seriously consider the security of the region because let's face it, the United States is in large part responsible for the kinds of weapons that we see coming into the region. Mexico made that point very clear to the United States as well recently
I,
that
I want you to pause there for a moment
yes,
because one of the executive orders, well, two of them actually, speak about protecting the Second Amendment rights of
yeah,
Americans.
yes,
And his administration should do nothing that would impede or impair in any way those rights. And the trafficking of illicit firearms
hmm,
into the Caribbean could be given a freeway on which to operate if the
yeah,
US government fails to take action against traffickers, given the
yes.
fact that most of the illegal weapons are coming from the United States. How will that fly in the
Well,
face of the Second Amendment?
yeah. I mean, this is one of the challenges you have, right? Um, if the U.S. wants to claim that guns don't kill people, people do. That's an internal problem that they're going to have to address, right? With the rise of and the sale of guns in domestically. But when this spills over into guns being sent to places like Trinidad and Jamaica and Barbados and different countries in the Caribbean, that sort of goes against our own security, our security in the region. We are now being insecure because of this influx of guns into the region, mostly by U.S. Armaments that come into the region. And that to me, I think is going to be one of the challenges you have in terms of trying to create a kind of a regional, if you call it regional collective security arrangement, because we've had these kind of agreements between the United States and the Caribbean, that the United States would come in and help protect the Caribbean against the intrusion of traffickers and so on, and gangs and small arms get into those countries in the region. But if there's a free flow of these weapons and a free flow of traffickers without any sort of limitations by the United States, this could pose a serious challenge, especially for countries that have very little in the capacity, in terms of capacity of dealing with these traffickers. Some of these traffickers have weapons that are military style weapons, and they're dealing with police in developing countries that aren't supposed to have these military style weapons. So they have an advantage over our local policemen and policewomen in the region. I'm just watching the situation in Trinidad right now because I spent a few years in Trinidad as director of the Institute of International Relations, and I'm appalled by what I'm seeing and hearing happening in the country in Trinidad. But this problem goes beyond Trinidad now. Jamaica has similar kinds of problems as well with traffickers, drug dealers, and so on. And this, what they call concatenated nature of the violence that has happened in these regions, in these countries, largely because of the US's failure to help to curb these instances and these traffickers. And it's only going to get worse because the US now will say it's not our problem, right? We're dealing with our own internal problems, and we're not going to be worried too much about what's happening in the Caribbean. And this opens up the door for another possibility, and that is that there's going to be a shift in terms of Caribbean countries having to make arrangements, regional arrangements with other countries, other big countries, such as China, such as Russia. So this is going to pose a problem for the United States in the United States backyard. It's already started to happen, where
I
China
want
has
us to
more
discuss
influence.
China.
Sorry?
I want us to discuss China
Yeah.
very comprehensively and its impact on the Caribbean a little later in the program.
Yeah.
Um, Let us take a pause right here
Mhm.
for a couple of minutes and come back to the second part of the program.
Sure.
When America wants to know what's happening in the Caribbean diaspora, there is one clear choice.
Hello, welcome to Carib Nation.
Both people inside and outside are
Very excited about today's program.
Looking at you, I can tell that you have traveled the journey.
One television organization brings America close to the people, stories, and events that affects Caribbean life. Get close, get answers, get Carib Nation.
Let us pick up where we left off. And I want to focus specifically on China's impact in the region in response to the Trump administration policies that are affecting the region.
Yep.
Also would like for us to take a brief look at the Middle East situation in particular, the pronouncements on Gaza and the sanctions being imposed on Iran and the threat to Iran and vice versa. I want us to look at the trade relations between Canada and Mexico
Mhm.
and the United States, as well as the Russia-Ukraine war, if we have the time, and how that impacts on the North Atlantic Alliance. There are so many things I would like for us to look at.
No, it's a huge agenda.
Cuba, Venezuela, the Panama Canal, and so on.
Sure.
So let's start with a question. Can China replace the US in Latin America and the Caribbean, and in particular in the Caribbean itself?
Yes, and I think, I've been like a fly on the wall in Trinidad when when Xi Jinping, his very first visit outside of China after being elected as president of China, um, came to visit Trinidad and Tobago. And in fact, the Trinidad and Tobago Prime Minister invited all the leaders in the region that supported China as a primary representative of Chinese people. They all came as well to Port of Spain. And one of the things I noticed was how aggressive Xi Jinping was in terms of asserting China's authority in the region directly, because he knows it was going to counter the United States. And the United States' failure to really support the region was one of the gaps he was trying to fill. And of course, one of the responses, of course, of the United States was to send Joe Biden, actually, before he became president. He was still vice president at the time. He was sent to Trinidad and Tobago just prior to Xi Jinping's visit. This showed the concerns that the United States had with the possibility that China was now playing in the backyard of the United States. But I think what that said to me, what it illustrated to me was that China is not afraid any longer to have countermeasures against the United States. Trump has a he talks a big talk. He has big uh, expressions about trying to counter China. But the Chinese-U.S. relationship is a very complex one, especially economically. And while Trump has taken an aggressive stance on trade to China, imposing 10% tariffs on all Chinese products and imports and so on, China has responded in kind. It actually has a even a more massive retaliatory tariff response, 15% tariffs on coal and liquefied natural gas, 50% tariffs on agricultural machinery, the displacement of cars as part of that particular approach. And also, they filed a lawsuit with the World Trade Organization to deal with the way in which the Americans are trying to utilize trade as a weapon. So this is not going to be an easy cakewalk on the part of the United States when it comes to dealing with China. China is able to strike back. It has the ability, it's much stronger than the United States thought it would be. It's actually replacing the United States in terms of hegemonic hierarchy in many different categories. It's not quite
And
yet.
China was ready with its response
Yeah.
quickly.
Yeah.
There was no hesitation. There was no reason. There was no gap in the
Right.
response. It was immediate.
Yes. And what I think the Americans are going to find out, and they're starting to realize this, is that other countries also have responses because they remember Trump 1.0.
Mm-hmm.
Canada, for example, has immediate responses now to the US attacks on trade and the tariffs. Um, Canada has an immediate response ready to
Yes.
go at the end
Yes.
of this month. And it's going to damage not just, they're being very selective and strategic in terms of how they're going to damage the United States. They're going to damage most of the red states that support the
Precisely.
Trump administration, right?
Targeted.
And they've
Targeted
created,
for the most effect.
exactly. And I live here in Canada, so I know I'm wearing my Canadian shirt today because I think there's now a new feeling among the majority of Canadians that they're no longer going to buy American products in the grocery stores, at Walmart, at McDonald's. I mean, there's going to be a blackout against the purchase of American products in this country. And even if Trump sort of decides to ease off on his tariffs to Canada, there's still going to be that residual response, right, from the Canadians.
Mm-hmm.
And that's going to affect the US economy. And we're going to see this in a major way pretty soon. And I think just to imagine that kind of response coming from China as well, that will impact American people who are purchasing Chinese products. They're the ones that are going to suffer from the tariffs. Europeans are also thinking they have a strategy in place as well to deal with the American attempts at tariffs imposed on American European goods. So the rest of the world has caught on. This is no longer a world in which the United States is the sole hegemon. This is a world in which a number of countries are catching up to the United States in terms of
Yes.
their own economic and military and material capacities. So I don't think that the Americans are going to have an easy time with this in the next 4 years, and it's going to be bedlam and chaos in the United States. But the rest of the world is going to find a way, I think, to collaborate among themselves to try to respond to what the United States is doing.
And the negative effect will be felt right here in the United States.
Correct.
I saw a report where farmers in red states who said they supported Trump are now crying out loud against the closing down of UNAID, I mean USAID,
Yeah,
because
because their products are now being left.
their goods are
Yeah,
sold for
yes.
to USAID. A
Mhm.
large percentage of USAID funds
Yeah,
purchase American goods for distribution abroad, and
correct.
farm products is a primary area. One
Hmm.
farmer said in the 2 weeks following the closing of USAID, he has lost $400 million in sales.
Yeah,
Now, I don't want to go too far into the domestic impact, but the domestic impact will also have a bearing on the global impact and will force some sort of revision within the White House, except for the fact that these are people of the ideological positions where they are unyielding, and there are no voices reaching President Trump that are moderating voices.
yes.
So we have to see how the international community will respond or cope with what has already started and what is yet to come.
Yeah. Well,
Um,
one thing I would say is that um, the world has changed a lot since the United States was a hegemonic power. It's no longer the same hegemonic power it was in 1945, and the country that helped rebuild Germany and Japan um, is no longer that strong unilateral power any longer. We
correct.
now live in a very global, multilateral world, regardless of what the United States may think. And that's going to have an impact on whether or not the US government and the Trump administration will be effective in trying to carry out their policies of unilateralism. Because, I think I can see the possibility right now that the whole notion of US leadership, which many of us had subscribed to, that notion is eroding right before our eyes. We're seeing people are not interested any longer in listening to the United States. It has no moral compass. It has no more moral ability to assert that kind of leadership any longer in the globe. So I think what we're witnessing right now is going to be something that backfires against the Trump administration in the long run, because individuals now learn how to operate without the United States. Canada is now learning how to operate without the United States.
Yes.
Mexico is now learning how to operate without the United States. They're learning how to do Mexican Canada cooperation, and the global South will learn how to cooperate globally as a unit. So South-South cooperation is going to replace that the largesse of the U.S. funding and so on in the global South. So
And
it may take a while, but I think it's started to happen right now, where we're witnessing now a change in the way in which whatever new world order is created is going to unfold. It's
You
not really
know,
something that's going to be driven by the United States leadership anymore.
I look back, and those of us who have been around a long time can look back at the 70s
Yes.
when Michael Manley was out there pushing South-South cooperation.
Yeah.
Donald Trump just may have provided the platform to increase that cooperation and make it real. Also, remember the advocacy for a new international economic order.
That's right.
The time is now.
Yes.
And the BRICS are attempting to do some of that.
Mm-hmm.
But I think now this new presidency in Washington and the policies will push more people, more countries to exploring alternatives.
Yeah.
But let us get back to some of what some people call dangerous statements coming out of Washington.
Mm-hmm.
Statements, some of which coincided, some of those executive orders coincided with the visit of Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu to Washington. The idea that the United States would own Gaza, the idea of putting severe sanctions on Iran beyond anything that we had seen in the past, and to encourage the Israeli Prime Minister in his rhetoric in terms of military operations or possible military operations against Iran.
Mm-hmm.
From what we see in those executive orders, President Trump would support Israel taking unilateral action against Iran, even without sharing it with the United States. The Middle East is teetering on war, more so now than ever before. But I'd like for you to just reflect a little bit on the impact on the people of Gaza.
Well, one of the first things that come to mind is the fact that the Trump administration's new announcements, because I can only call it that, because I don't see a policy yet, but I see announcements being made about what he would like to do in Gaza. Most of it's unrealistic to begin with, because I don't think you're going to get the support of other countries around in the region to Trump's ideas. But certainly, it could spell the death nail of to the two state solution that was being um, proposed by the Biden administration, right? And is much more in tune with what Netanyahu would like to see, and that is a one-state solution, um, where Israel is the apartheid-like state, where Palestinians could live in this state called Israel, but they will have to follow certain rules. They will have to show their passes to get around the country, literally like what apartheid was like in South Africa. And I think this is damaging, I think, to anyone who supported the Palestinian people, including, people from Jordan and Syria and other countries around the region. So I think this is damaging overall to this idea of a two-state solution in that bosom of the Israeli and Palestinian states. Now, it also, I think, poses a tremendous danger to global security if you start to impose major sanctions or renew sanctions and increase sanctions on Iran. let's face it, Iran is now a nuclear weapon state. It's maybe not yet declared as a nuclear weapon state, but it has the capacity to create nuclear weapons. And I can see the possibility of collaboration between other nuclear weapon states, new nuclear weapon states, Korea, North Korea, Iran, etc. This poses a danger to global security in general.
Yes.
You increase these number of nuclear weapon states. So what the Trump administration should be doing is trying to reduce that danger to global security because it's going to affect us all. It's not something that's going to happen just in the Middle East. It's going to affect us all. And I think the danger of having a unilateral American policy with respect to Iran is that he's going to need the collaboration and cooperation of the European states and other states in the region to counter what Iran is trying to do. And this is not going to happen if you take a unilateral approach to Iran. And I think that's a danger that we are going to see play itself out in the next few years. Iran is much stronger than many people here in the West can even fathom in terms of its closeness to becoming a nuclear weapon state. And also its resilience. Think about this, the number of years that people were saying that this administration in Iran was going to fall, and 40 years later is still surviving. I mean, there's a kind of resilience that's there um, to the ultra, the ultra extremist government of Iran, if you will, because they have the support of their population in large part, except for perhaps for the Baha'is who are being persecuted by the Iranian people, by the Iranian government. But in large part, they're being supported by their population. So that lends a level of resilience. And Iran does have um, alliances with other countries as well that they can draw upon in order to be able to counter whatever the United States is doing.
One of the things we have to look out for or anticipate is the use of secondary sanctions by the Trump administration.
Yeah.
In the case of the Iran sanctions and the sale of Iran oil to countries like India and China and elsewhere, secondary sanctions is a very seldomly used tool. But this Trump administration is not inclined to use diplomatic tools. And based on the wording of the executive orders on Iran and the sale of Iran oil, it appears to me that secondary sanctions may be in the making. Question is, will the US be bold enough, or the Trump administration be bold enough to sanction India or to increase tariff on India for purchasing of Iranian oil? Let's see how far that goes.
But one of the things that to me speaks to is interfering in the internal affairs of another state, like India, or in the case of China, in some cases. This idea of secondary sanctions imposed on countries just because they're buying, oil from Iran, is something that will not go over very well in India. It will not go over very well in China. It will be there will be retaliations, and I think the United States is not prepared for that yet because they're trying to strengthen their bond with countries like India. Um, these are countries that have in the past been much more subservient to the United States because they didn't have the capacity and the power that they have today. India is now becoming a power of its own that could challenge, not necessarily challenge the US's power overall, but certainly has risen in terms of the hierarchy of states, has risen to a level where it doesn't have to depend as much on the United States. And this is one of the things that I'm looking at in my own research is the extent to which countries are learning how to operate without the United States. In other words, uh, to be less subservient to the United States, to be less means to be less dependent on the United States, its goods and services. Um, so they would try to create new alliances with other countries other than the United States as a result of all this. So this could have a negative impact on the United States domestic policy
Certainly
too.
will. It certainly will. And India itself is becoming quite an economic powerhouse.
Yeah.
And the United States needs India as a buffer against China
Precisely.
in that part of the world.
Yeah.
So this is something that I will be watching very closely, and I'm sure you will be too,
Yes.
because the executive order, particularly against Iran,
Mm-hmm.
and the sale of Iran's oil or the purchase of Iran's oil, countries like Canada are in the crosshairs.
Yeah.
All of these issues really raise serious questions for the global economy, global security,
Correct.
and the individual economies and security of states. There is no internal buffer to what the Trump administration is doing. The Secretary of State is himself a hardliner,
Mm-hmm.
and every individual being put in the cabinet of the Trump administration will do whatever Trump wants.
Mm-hmm.
Will do whatever Project 2025 has set out for them to do.
Yeah.
So there will be turmoil domestically. But my major concern and the essence of this conversation we are having is on the global impact. In our region, immediately coming into office, one of the first acts of the Trump administration is to designate Cuba as a state sponsor of terrorism.
Mm-hmm.
As you well know, President Obama removed that designation. Trump 101 reinstated it.
Mm-hmm.
Biden removed it. And now Trump has put it back. And again, I come back to the collateral effect of such a designation. What does it mean to countries doing business with Cuba?
Mm-hmm.
In particular, the countries of the Caribbean.
Mm-hmm.
Will they suffer consequences? And I come back to the whole question of secondary sanctions. How will Trump respond to Caribbean countries in their continued relationship with Cuba? I know we're not going to try to predict how he will respond,
Mm-hmm.
but what if?
Well, what I can see happening is a diminishing of U.S. engagement with Caribbean countries that will persist on engaging with Cuba, for example. Now that he's reinstated this idea that somehow Cuba is an enemy state of the United States. We thought that was gone with both Obama and then Biden administrations. But he wants to return to that, and I think in large part because, as you said, the Secretary of State is very anti-Cuban in his approach, um, and will continue to persist on pursuing that particular tact. It will have an impact on countries like Jamaica and Trinidad and Guyana that may want to, and Barbados that may want to continue um, policies of engagement with Cuba, because I can see the United States punishing those countries, or at least creating a division within CARICOM between those countries that want to support Cuba and those that will not. So my fear is that the Trump 2.0 will not just diminish U.S. engagement in the region in terms of reducing economic and security support to the region, but it also will make these countries in the region much more vulnerable to external pressures coming from other places. So, for example, Russia may want to step in um, if countries are being punished for their engagement with Cuba. China may want to step in as well if that happens in the region. So the United States could be faced with a retaliation that it never anticipated coming from other regional powers that may be developing relationships within our region. Venezuela, for example, has pretty good relations with Russia and with China as well. And I think Trinidad and Tobago has pretty good relations with Russia and China as well. So I can see that possibility happening. What I think is, even in terms of the broader picture, is the fact that Caribbean states now have no choice but to start to think about having a greater reliance on alternative powers other than the United States. So the shifting of regional dynamics and the shifting of regional influence is one of the things that we should watch for in the years ahead, in the next 3 or 4 years. In some ways, this is helping to weaken the US's position, is helping to weaken global norms that many of the small states had latched onto, because it helped to raise them up within the international community. It gave them a voice, it gave them a platform to deal with issues of concern to the Caribbean, climate change, pandemics, etc. So what we're going to witness, I think, is a shift in alliances, the way in which we align ourselves. There's a good book on the changing nature of alliances that I just read recently that talked about the fact that many countries that wanted to maintain a kind of a distance from the United States and Russia, they were part of the so-called non-aligned movement, right? I can see the non-aligned movement growing even larger now as a result of what Trump is trying to do. And also recognizing the threat that comes from Russia when Russia undermines international laws with respect to the independence of sovereign states, like Ukraine. So I can see a combination of things happening here that would lead to a realignment, if you will, of the alliance structure that has been created since 1945 to the present. And a lot more states will want to be part of the non-aligned movement as opposed to being aligned with the United States or any other country.
I would add a little bit to that and say I see uh, an expansion of cooperation in what is now being called the Global South. I think economic, political, and other types of cooperation
Yeah,
are imminent. While we are on the question of the hemisphere,
yeah.
Panama Canal,
Mhm,
your thoughts on Trump's, what I consider to be wild dream
mhm.
of reclaiming the Panama Canal?
Yeah, interestingly enough, I think Trump's claim I think it's a wild dream, in fact, yeah, to reclaim the Panama Canal is not based on any sort of actual evidence that he has the capacity to do this. I think a lot of it has to do with his own personal vendetta against Panama for the way in which his company was treated.
I'm doing my
Yeah,
interview right now.
yes. So I think that that's a challenge for the region, but I don't think that he'd be very successful in doing this. So it's almost on the same level as saying that Canada should become the 51st state of the United States. That's never going to happen, right? It's not going to happen that he's going to be able to purchase Greenland. I mean, these are all. I think one of the things that Trump is very good at doing is getting himself in the headlines of newspapers and people who want to follow whatever he's doing by having these outrageous claims and outrageous statements. That keeps him relevant to some extent, right? But what it does do as well is to show how weak the United States presidency really is. Then he's not able to accomplish these things. So we're going to go through a period of time where he's going to say all these outrageous things, but then the reality sets in. For example, his claim that he will impose tariffs on Canada could backfire to the point where his own people that supported him in the last election may go against him. So there's this now building of opposition movements across the country, the United States, many coming from areas that supported the Trump administration in this last election. So I think this is working across purposes with what he's really trying to do, and could end up hurting him rather than helping him.
While we are on the region, during the first Trump administration, Secretary of State Rex Tillerson and Mike Pompeo warned Latin America and the Caribbean about what he called China's economic policies.
Mm-hmm.
And this time around, I think the whole issue is bigger now.
Mm-hmm.
And you have a Secretary of State in Marco Rubio who is very hardline against China. So will we be hearing more? Or I expect to be hearing more from Marco Rubio in public about what his former Secretaries of State called predatory economic practices. And how will that affect countries like Jamaica that has such a close relationship with China?
Mm-hmm.
And other countries in the region who maintain close relationship with China. And after that, I'd like for you to just share your thoughts on the tariffs on aluminum and steel, because Jamaican bauxite and Guyanese bauxite are inputs in the aluminum market. And thirdly, the Caribbean Basin Security Initiative, I believe, is under threat. In Trump's first administration, he cut his first budget sent to Congress in 2017, cut funding for the CBSI in half. In a month or so, the Caribbean Basin Economic Recovery Act is up for renewal. CBERA provides concessionary entry tariff-free entry for a lot of goods from the Caribbean. So I've given you a whole lot of stuff I need to cover in the next few minutes.
Okay. Let me start with, first of all, with the China's engagement with the Caribbean, because I think this is very, very important information that most Caribbean people may not recognize is happening. But there's certainly, China has invested very heavily in infrastructural projects in the Caribbean. What they call the Belt and Road Initiative, that used to be considered to be outside of the region of the Caribbean, is now within the region of the Caribbean.
That is correct.
China's Belt and Road Initiative has resulted in highway projects, infrastructure projects such as highway construction, port development, industrial parks. For example, the China Harbor Engineering Company is building a port in La Brea in Trinidad. When it was there in Trinidad, they'd already started that project. And Trinidad and Tobago now has been able to increase its gas exportation because of that project. So that's not going to be easy to address by the Trump administration, because China already has now an embedded reason for staying in the Caribbean because of these kind of projects. Think about energy and natural resources you mentioned, aluminum and steel, but also think about China's investment in the energy sector,
Yes.
in oil and gas exploration in the region, including Guyana, and renewable energy projects, which is a huge deal for Caribbean states that are trying to deal with the climate change challenge.
Correct.
Right? The China's National Offshore Oil Corporation has a 25% stake in the Starbuck block in Guyana. 25% stake in terms of offshore crude oil deposits in Guyana. So that's something that's not going to change anytime soon. America does have also a stake in that as well.
And 49% stake in Kingston Harbor,
Exactly.
the
Yeah,
largest transshipment harbor in the Caribbean.
that's right. That's right.
The only Container Security Initiative certified port in the English-speaking Caribbean.
Right, right. And this adds to the fact that China has now become a significant trading partner with many Caribbean countries.
Yes.
And bilateral trade now has increased from 1 billion in 2002 to 8 billion in 2019. From 1 billion in 2002 to 8 billion in 2019. But today in 2025, that trade is also increased. So the significant trading partnership between Caribbean states and China is happening as we speak. And recently I was reading that 10 Caribbean countries have already signed on to the Belt and Road Initiative.
That's correct.
Through corporations with China, including Cuba, Jamaica, Dominican Republic, Antigua and Barbuda, Dominica, Barbados, Grenada, Trinidad and Tobago, Guyana, and Suriname. And those countries that are still outside of that BRI, like St. Vincent and so on, are slowly being coaxed into becoming part of the so-called One China policy, so that they can become part of this arrangement, because there are significant benefits to be held from that partnership with China. So these are things that we cannot take for granted any longer. China has a very strong hold now on the region that's steep in economics. And that's going to be very difficult for Caribbean countries to ignore. And it's going to be very difficult for the Trump administration to challenge, as they have been able to challenge in the past. So I think that's one of the points that you wanted to make. The other stuff about steel and bauxite, I mean, I think it's, again, this is one of those things that will affect American companies if they have imposed tariffs or sanctions on Jamaica, because they can end up not getting what is necessary for the creation of steel and aluminum products. So this is a challenge for the Trump administration as well. I don't know if
Absolutely.
I answered all your questions, but I
There are quite a few, and I just wanted to touch on one more issue: the relationship between Venezuela
Mhm,
and the Caribbean, not the situation between Venezuela and Guyana, but under Petrocaribe and whatever they have now,
mhm,
versus the Trump administration policy with regard to Venezuela. Because it seems to me
mhm,
that under Trump's policy, it's okay for his administration to deal with Venezuela, but it's not okay for others to do so.
mhm.
What is your take on that?
This is what's causing division, I think, as well in CARICOM. And I think we have to be very concerned as people from the Caribbean region with the possibility that the Trump administration is going to be involved in this sort of divide and conquer strategy, so that it will give support for certain things in Venezuela, but then punish Caribbean countries for supporting Venezuela, and that creates a split, a division within CARICOM. And I think one of the people that I think is very much knowledgeable about what can happen in that split is Mia Motley, who is now the head of CARICOM. And she's very much aware of the kind of splits that happened during the first Trump administration by trying to sort of separate out countries like Jamaica from the rest of the CARICOM, countries like St. Lucia and other countries, the Dominican Republic, I believe, and the Bahamas. So it created a kind of a split in CARICOM. And one of the things that we have to be very careful about is how can we avoid that split? How can we maintain a kind of a unified voice in CARICOM? Because we're going to have to do that if we're going to challenge President Trump. That's the only way we're going to be able to challenge his policies in the region, and that includes not just Venezuela but also Haiti and the way in which Haiti will be dealt with in the
We
future.
saw we saw a lot of disunity in
Yeah.
CARICOM during the first Trump administration. Don't forget the visits of both Tillerson and Pompeo to Kingston,
Yes. Exactly.
and who were invited and who were not.
Exactly.
And in this new administration, I expect that, and basically you have identified some challenges. I expect that unity to be even more impacted.
Yes. But we see it already in terms of some opposition leaders in the Caribbean who are pro-Trump. We saw this in Trinidad, right, with Kamala
I
Persaud.
I
That
was
left.
shocked by that statement.
I was devastated by that statement
I was
because
shocked by that statement.
it showed the extent of first of all, the ignorance
Ignorance is a mild term.
is some other term, but it just devastated anyone who had any hope that she could become the next leader of Trinidad and Tobago. I mean, she when she was one of the reasons why she only had one term as prime minister was because of her failing policies in the country. People still remember that. Then the PNM was elected to office, and the PNM has had its problems with crime and um, this problem now with the COP in Trinidad. Uh, but it gives Trinidadians a time to reflect on what Kamala Persaud is all about when she starts to give out to the United States this notion that somehow she's completely in support of all of these policies that are MAGA related policies, Make America Great policies. It goes against everything that Trinidad government has been trying to do. So I think that division is already started, and it started with some opposition party leaders who could become government, and if they do become government, they'd be much more supportive of the Trump administration than the current government is.
Yeah.
And I think that's one of the things I'm very concerned about myself.
And we should be,
Mhm.
because I am really quite surprised at how uninformed
Yeah.
many of our Caribbean leaders are.
Mhm.
I guarantee you, none have even read a chapter of Project 2025.
Right.
And many of them believe, oh, Trump said that, but he doesn't really mean that.
Mhm.
Believe me, he means everything he says.
Yeah.
He's sure that he meant everything he said, and he's surrounding himself with people who will carry out those crazy policies.
Yeah.
So we're in for a pretty difficult time.
Yeah.
I know we have been at this now for quite a while, and I want to thank you very much for being my guest on Carib Nation TV and on this program. Thank you so much.
And thank you very much for having me on. And if I might say one last thing,
Sure.
because I think this ties into something that you said earlier, and that is we cannot separate the domestic from the international any longer. I mean, I call it the intermestic phenomenon, right?
Yes.
International and domestic politics are now intertwined to the point where you cannot separate the two. So actions that you might think are global in impact can also have a boomerang effect domestically as well. And I think that's what we're going to see with the Trump administration, this collapse between global and international, international and global, plus domestic policies that collapse will happen during this administration.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for your insightful comments.
Thank you.
Thank you.